The gun was already pressed against Clarence Rourke's temple when Alberta Fletcher screamed his name. She had not meant to scream. She had meant to stay hidden behind the water barrel at the edge of Dusty Creek's main street, crouched low in the shadows, the way her father had taught her when she was barely old enough to hold a rifle. But the sight of Harlan Voss with his thick fingers wrapped around Clarence's collar, the barrel of that Colt revolver digging a white circle into his skin, stripped every rational thought right out of her. "Alberta," Clarence's voice was low, controlled, even with metal against his skull. "You run. Do you hear me? You get yourself gone." Harlan Voss laughed, and the sound was worse than the gun. It was the laugh of a man who had already decided how everything would end. He was broad-shouldered and red-faced, wearing a sheriff's badge that he had no right to wear, and his eyes found Alberta in the shadow the way a snake finds warmth. "Well now," Harlan said, "isn't this exactly what I wanted?" Alberta's hands were shaking. She had the derringer her mother had left her, small and pearl-handled, tucked against her ribs. 2 shots. Harlan had 4 men flanking him on the street, each one watching her with the flat patience of men hired to watch and wait and act without conscience. This was the moment. This was the precise moment where every secret she had tried to protect, every dark truth she had buried under 6 months of careful silence, was going to tear itself wide open. 3 days ago she had not even known Clarence Rourke's real name. 6 months ago she had arrived in Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, on the afternoon stage from Santa Fe in the summer of 1883. She had a single trunk, $42 sewn into the hem of her skirt, a letter of introduction folded twice and tucked inside her boot, and a plan that she had been working on since the night her brother disappeared. Alberta Fletcher was 24 years old, dark-haired, steady-eyed, and entirely alone in the world. Her father, Thomas Fletcher, had been a cattle surveyor for a land company operating out of St. Louis. He had died of a fever in the spring of 1882, leaving Alberta the small house in Kansas City that they had shared and very little else, because the land company had decided that his death voided his employment contract and therefore voided every outstanding payment they owed him. Her brother, Daniel Fletcher, had gone west ahead of her. He was 26, headstrong in the way that only older brothers could be, and he had written her letters every week without fail until the letters stopped. The last one had been dated December of 1882, posted from Dusty Creek, and it said only this: "I have found something, Bertie. Something the wrong people do not want found. If you do not hear from me by February, go to a man named Gideon Cross at the assay office. He will know what to do." She had not heard from Daniel by February. She had not heard from him at all. She had sold the house in Kansas City, packed her trunk, and come west. The stage rolled into Dusty Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in July, and Alberta's first impression of the place was heat and dust, and a main street that seemed to be daring anyone to make something of themselves on it. There were 2 saloons, a general store, a livery stable, a small church with peeling white paint, the assay office, a telegraph station, and a building marked sheriff's office with a new sign above the door that read H. Voss, duly appointed. She had not known then what that sign would come to mean. She had climbed down from the stage, retrieved her trunk, and stood on the boardwalk orienting herself the way her father had taught her to orient herself in any new place. Look for water. Look for shade. Find the person who knows where everything is and never seems to be looking for it. The person she found was Mrs. Eulalia Marsh, who ran the town's boarding house and was apparently incapable of being anywhere without knowing what was happening in every direction simultaneously. She was 60, stout, with silver hair pinned under a practical bonnet, and she looked Alberta up and down with the kind of assessment that was not unkind but was completely honest. "You are not the mail-order bride," Mrs. Marsh said. "No," Alberta said. "I'm a paying guest if you have a room." "I have 2 rooms. One faces the street, and one faces the alley. The street room is quieter than you'd think because Dusty Creek mostly dies down after 9, and the alley room smells like the livery stable when the wind comes from the east. Both are $1.50 a week, meals included. I'll take the street room. Good choice. Come on then. Mrs. Marsh had fed her biscuits and salt pork that evening, and over supper Alberta had learned a great deal about Dusty Creek without asking any direct questions, because Mrs. Marsh was the kind of woman who told you what she thought you ought to know whether you asked for it or not. She learned that Harlan Voss had been appointed sheriff 8 months ago by a land company representative who had come down from Santa Fe. She learned that the previous sheriff, a man named Cole, had left town suddenly and nobody talked about it. She learned that there was a new Asser who had taken over the office after Gideon Cross retired and moved away. And she learned that there was a man living at the edge of town in a small rented room above the blacksmith shop who had been in Dusty Creek for about 4 months and kept mostly to himself, and whose name, Mrs. Marsh said, was something like Clark or Clancy. She could never remember. Alberta ate her biscuits and filed all of it away. She went to the assay office the next morning. The new Asser was a man named Pettiford, thin and nervous in the way of a man who knows he has been placed where he is for a specific reason and is not entirely comfortable with that reason. He told her Gideon Cross had moved to Albuquerque. He told her there was nothing she needed at the assay office. He told her all of this while looking at a point slightly to the left of her face, which Alberta recognized as the behavior of a man performing a script. She thanked him and left. She went to the general store, bought thread she did not need, and spent 20 minutes letting the proprietor, a cheerful man named Abe Tolliver, tell her about everything and everyone in Dusty Creek while she appeared to examine spools of cotton thread with great interest. From Abe Tolliver, she learned that her brother Daniel had been in town and had worked for several months as a surveyor's assistant for a company called Meridian Land and Mineral. She learned that Daniel had left town, according to the official story, in January, heading back east. She learned that this was what everyone said, and that several people, including Abe Tolliver, seemed faintly uncomfortable saying it. She walked back out into the heat of July in New Mexico territory, and she stood on the boardwalk outside the general store, and she understood that her brother had not left town in January. She understood that something had happened to Daniel, and that Meridian Land and Mineral and possibly Harlan Voss and his badge were connected to it. She also understood that she could not go at this alone, and that she needed to find someone she could trust in a town where trust was the most dangerous currency available. It was on her 4th day in Dusty Creek that she met the man who went by the name Clark. She had been walking back from the church, where the pastor, a gentle older man named Reverend Hubbard, had agreed to let her look through the record books of people who had attended services. She had been looking for anything connected to Daniel, any entry, any note. She had found nothing useful, and she was walking back along the side street that ran parallel to Main, thinking hard and not watching where she was going, and she walked directly into a man coming the other way around the corner of the blacksmith shop. She stumbled. He caught her, both hands on her arms, a firm and entirely automatic steadying grip. "Careful," he said. She looked up. He was tall, several inches over 6 feet, lean in the way of a man who worked physically and ate only what was necessary. His hair was dark brown and slightly too long, his jaw carrying several days of beard. His eyes were gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they were looking at her with an expression she could not quite categorize, something between wariness and something softer that he was actively suppressing. He released her arms the moment she had her footing. "I apologize," she said. "I was not paying attention." "Neither was I," he said, which she doubted. He struck her immediately as a man who was always paying attention. She looked at him more carefully, the way she had learned to look at things that mattered, quickly and without appearing to do so. His hands were calloused but not in the pattern of a blacksmith or a ranch hand. His boots were good quality but worn down on the inside of the left heel in a way that suggested a man who spent long hours standing and watching rather than riding or walking. He wore a gun on his hip, well maintained, and his coat was dusty but good wool. "You are the man above the blacksmith shop," she said. Something moved across his face. "People in this town talk. Mrs. Marsh considers it a civic duty." The ghost of something that was almost a smile crossed his mouth and disappeared. "I suppose she does. You are Miss Fletcher. You arrived Tuesday on the stage. Mrs. Marsh considers that a civic duty too." "She does." He looked at her for a moment, then away, and she had the impression that he was making a decision. "I am Clark," he said. "Good morning, Miss Fletcher." He walked on. She watched him go and thought, that is not his name. She did not know why she thought it. There was nothing specific she could point to. But there was something in the way he had said it, something practiced and faintly weighted, that rang false in the way a coin rings false when you drop it on a hard surface and the sound comes back wrong. She thought about it all afternoon, and by evening she had decided it did not matter what his name was. What mattered was what he was and what he was doing in Dusty Creek. She got her answer sooner than she expected. On her 6th day in town, she found the letter. It was not hidden expertly, which suggested either that Daniel had not had time or that he had not expected to need to hide it. She found it tucked inside the spine of a Bible at the church, where Reverend Hubbard had let her sit in the afternoons when the heat made the boarding house stifling. She had been working through the hymnals and the spare Bibles on the shelf behind the pulpit, looking for she did not know exactly what, and the envelope had fallen out when she opened the third Bible from the left, her brother's handwriting. She did not open it there. She tucked it into her bodice and walked back to her room at the boarding house with her hands perfectly still, and her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped animal. The letter was 4 pages, written small and close in Daniel's rapid hand. He had been working for Meridian Land and Mineral as a survey assistant, and in the course of that work, he had discovered that the company was systematically falsifying land surveys throughout the territory. They were recording mineral-rich land as worthless scrubland, buying it at nothing prices from ranchers who did not know what they had, and then filing corrected surveys privately with a connected official in Santa Fe who held the records until the purchases were complete. It was fraud of a scale that Alberta had to read twice to fully absorb. The amount of land involved was enormous. Daniel had taken copies of the survey records. He had hidden them. He had gone to the old Assyr, Gideon Cross, who had agreed to help him get the documents to a federal land office agent. But then Harlan Voss had been appointed sheriff by a Meridian Company representative, and everything had changed overnight. The letter ended without any indication of what had happened next, only a location. A set of coordinates written in the surveyor's notation that Daniel used, the kind their father had taught them both as children, which was also, Alberta realized with a sick lurch, the kind that most people would not recognize as coordinates at all. She sat with the letter for a long time in the fading light of her room. Then she put it back in her bodice next to her skin, and she went to find the man who called himself Clark. She knocked on the door above the blacksmith shop at 7 in the evening. He answered it in his shirt sleeves, no jacket, his hand going automatically to a gun that was not there, his expression switching through several things very rapidly before settling into careful blankness. "Miss Fletcher, I need to speak with you," she said. "I know who you are." He was very still. "You had better come in." The room was spare and clean. A narrow bed, a small table, 2 chairs, a washstand, a saddlebag on the floor. On the table was a map, and he had moved to stand in front of it before she fully registered what it was, but she had seen enough. She told him about Daniel. She told him about the letter. She did not tell him where the survey records were hidden, because she was not foolish enough to lay down every card at once with a man whose name she still did not know. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down in one of the chairs and rubbed his face with his hands, and for just a moment he looked tired in a way that was so deeply human that it cracked something in her chest. "Your brother," he said, "Daniel Fletcher." "Yes, I knew him," he said. "Not well. But I knew who he was and what he was doing." He paused. "Miss Fletcher, I have to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly." She had braced herself before he spoke again. "Your brother is alive," he said. The room seemed to tilt. "How do you know that?" "Because I have seen him in the last 3 weeks. He is not in Dusty Creek. He is being held at a Meridian Company property about 30 miles northeast, and he has been held there since January. They kept him alive because they could not find what he took from them." Alberta pressed her hands together in her lap and made herself breathe. "Who are you?" He looked at her steadily. "My name is Clarence Rourke. I'm a special investigator for the Office of the United States Surveyor General, working under a direct commission from Washington. I have been in this territory for 4 months building a case against Meridian Land and Mineral. Your brother was not supposed to be involved. He found it on his own and got ahead of it, and now he is in a great deal of danger." The name settled into her like something that had been waiting to settle. Clarence Rourke. It fit him, somehow, better than Clark. Solid and unadorned. "You were not going to tell me," she said. "I was going to tell you as soon as I had a safe way to do it. You have been in Dusty Creek for 4 months. The situation was not safe until I knew who could be trusted." She looked at him. He was watching her with those gray-green eyes, and she realized that he was waiting for her to be angry, and that he would accept it without deflection if she was, and that this more than anything else he had said or done so far made her believe him. "The coordinates in Daniel's letter," she said. "The survey records. They are hidden at those coordinates. I can read the notation because my father taught both of us." He was very still again. "Where are they?" she told him. It was the beginning. Over the following weeks, Clarence Rourke became the most important person in Alberta Fletcher's daily life, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that this was only partly because he was necessary to finding her brother and building the case that would free him and bring down Meridian. The larger part of it was that she had never in her 24 years met anyone quite like him. He was 31 years old, she learned. He had grown up in Ohio, the son of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when he was 12. He had studied law for 2 years before deciding that the law as practiced in an office was too distant from the places where it actually mattered. He had gone to work for the federal government 8 years ago, first as a surveyor himself, then as an investigator when the scale of land fraud across the territories became too large to ignore. He told her these things gradually, in the hours they spent together working through the case, and she noticed that he told her things about himself not in the way of a man who talked easily about himself, but in the way of a man who was making a deliberate decision each time to offer something, as if he understood that trust was built incrementally, and that he owed her the building of it. She told him things about herself in return, because it would have been unfair not to, and because she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wanted to. She told him about her father, about the surveying work, about the long summers she and Daniel had spent as children following their father across Kansas and Missouri, learning to read land the way some children learn to read books. She told him about Kansas City after her father died, the quiet and the loneliness and the terrible practicality of having to sell everything to survive. He listened the way he did everything, with complete attention, not performing interest but actually present. They retrieved Daniel's hidden survey documents on a Thursday, just before dawn, riding out of town in separate directions, and meeting at a dry creek bed 4 miles east. The documents were exactly where the coordinates indicated, sealed in an oilcloth packet tucked into a rock formation that looked natural until you knew exactly where to press. Clarence handled them carefully, going through each page with quick, practiced eyes. She watched his face as he read and saw satisfaction that was almost painful in its restraint. "This is enough," he said quietly. "This is more than enough. Cross and your brother together with these documents will end Meridian. Then we need Daniel." "Yes," he said, "we do." He looked up from the documents. "I will not lie to you about the risk of what comes next. I did not come to New Mexico territory for easy," she said. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite name, something layered and careful, and underneath it something that made the morning air feel different. "No," he said, I did not think you did." They rode back to town in the early light, and Alberta was aware of him riding beside her with an awareness that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the way the light caught the angle of his jaw, and the way he sat a horse as though he had been born in the saddle, easy and assured without being careless. She was falling in love with him. She recognized it because she had been in love once before, with a young man in Kansas City who had been gentle and kind and ultimately too frightened of her independence to stay, and she knew the feeling from the inside. This was the same feeling and entirely different at the same time. Older, heavier, built on something more solid than shared Sunday afternoons and polite conversation. She did not say anything about it. They had a plan to execute and a brother to rescue, and a case to bring to federal court, and the feelings she carried were her own business until there was room to make them anyone else's. The plan to free Daniel took 2 more weeks to assemble. Clarence had contacts he could reach by telegraph, carefully worded, through the telegraph station when the operator, a young man named Peebles who was terrified of Harlan Voss in the straightforward way of a young man who valued continued breathing, could be given a reason to step out for 15 minutes. A federal marshal by the name of Reeves was riding down from Colorado with 2 deputies. They were 4 days out. Alberta spent those 2 weeks learning Dusty Creek better than she had ever learned Kansas City. She made herself known and useful in ways that attracted no specific attention. She helped Mrs. Marsh with the garden. She sat with Reverend Hubbard and discussed scripture, because the Reverend was quietly terrified of Voss and his men and needed someone to talk to. She listened to Abe Tolliver at the general store and learned which of Voss's 4 deputies was which, and what each man's particular weakness was. She also spent 3 evenings a week in the room above the blacksmith shop, and she told herself this was entirely about the case. On the 3rd such evening, they had been going over the final steps of the plan when Clarence had fallen silent in a way that was different from his usual thinking silences, and she had looked up from the map to find him watching her. "What is it?" she asked. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want to be clear before I do that it is not connected to anything we are doing here. It is separate from the case and from your brother and from any of it." Her heart did something inconvenient. "All right." "I have been a federal investigator for 8 years," he said, "and in that time I have worked with a number of people in a number of places, and I have learned to read people the way your father apparently taught you to read land. It is not something I would claim to do perfectly, but I am good at it." He paused. "I have never met anyone like you, Alberta." It was the first time he had used her given name. "In what sense?" she managed. "In every sense," he said. "You are the bravest person I have encountered in 8 years of this work, and I want to be clear that I mean that as a statement of fact and not as a compliment intended to make you feel flattered. I am not particularly easy to flatter. No, that is also true." He looked at her directly. "I am telling you this because I believe in being honest when honesty is possible, and because when this is over I would like, with your permission, to talk to you about what comes next. Not what comes next for the case, for us." Alberta looked at him for a moment. Outside the window the night sounds of Dusty Creek were doing their ordinary business, a horse shifting in the livery stable, the distant music from one of the saloons, the dry, warm wind moving through the gap under the door. "I think that is a conversation I would like to have," she said. He nodded once, and there was something in his face that was so carefully contained and so obviously moved that she had to look back down at the map to keep herself from doing something that would have been significantly ahead of any reasonable timeline. "Then we finish this first," he said, and she heard the smile in his voice even though she was not looking at him. "We finish this first," she agreed. 4 days later, Marshal Reeves arrived. He was a tall black man of about 45, with a steady manner and a reputation that Clarence had spoken of with unambiguous respect. He had his 2 deputies, both competent and quiet. He had reviewed the copies of the survey documents that Clarence had sent ahead by telegraph summary, and he understood the full scope of what they were dealing with. They met outside of town at the Dry Creek bed on a Sunday evening, Clarence and Alberta and Marshal Reeves and his deputies, and they planned the operation that would free Daniel Fletcher from the Meridian Company property to the northeast. Alberta was not supposed to be part of the retrieval. This had been made clear. Clarence had said it directly, and Marshal Reeves had confirmed it with the polite firmness of a man who did not argue about such things, but who also did not change his mind about them. She had agreed, and she had meant it when she agreed. What she had not told them was that she had found out, through the careful weeks of listening and watching in Dusty Creek, that Harlan Voss had been notified that federal law enforcement was approaching. She did not know how. Someone in the telegraph chain had talked, or someone had seen Marshal Reeves on the road and sent a rider ahead. She found this out on the morning of the retrieval, from Abe Tolliver at the general store, who told her in a whispered rush that one of Voss's men had ridden out before dawn heading northeast, and that Voss himself had said something to his remaining deputies about guests coming to town that needed to be managed. She had approximately 3 hours before the plan fell apart. She sent a message to Clarence through the only channel she had available to her on short notice, a note pressed into Mrs. Marsh's hand, with an explanation that took Mrs. Marsh's eyes wide, but that she absorbed without fainting, because Mrs. Marsh was a practical woman who had lived in the West long enough to know that circumstances sometimes required you to be part of something larger than your own safety. Then she had gone to find Harlan Voss, not because she thought she could outbluff him, not because she thought she was faster with a derringer than he was with a Couldnt, but because she understood that the only way to buy Clarence and the marshals enough time to reach Daniel before Voss's rider did was to keep Voss occupied here in town. She had walked into the sheriff's office in the middle of the morning, calm and direct, and told Harlan Voss that she knew exactly what Meridian Land and Mineral had been doing, that she had the documents to prove it, and that she was giving him the opportunity to remove himself from Dusty Creek before the federal marshals arrived. It was a bluff. She did not have the documents on her. But she said it with the absolute conviction of a woman who had spent 6 months carrying the weight of her brother's disappearance and had decided that enough was enough. Voss had looked at her with those flat eyes, and then he had smiled, and that was when everything had gone sideways. Because Voss had people watching the roads, and one of those people had already seen Marshal Reeves and recognized him, and Voss had decided that the simplest answer was to use Alberta Fletcher as leverage. He had walked her out onto the main street with his gun out and his 4 men arranged around him, and he had waited, and Clarence Rourke had come. Alberta did not know then how Clarence knew to come to the main street. She found out later that Mrs. Marsh had delivered the note, and that Clarence had read it and sent a rider to Marshal Reeves and then come himself at a dead run, because, as he told her afterward, there was no version of the situation in which he was going to be anywhere other than where she was. Now he was standing on the main street of Dusty Creek with Harlan Voss's gun against his head, and Alberta Fletcher was crouched behind a water barrel with a 2-shot derringer, and a derringer full of calculations that none of them added up favorably. "Miss Fletcher," Voss called, "I want those documents, every page your brother stole and everything the government man there has assembled. You bring them to me in the next 5 minutes, or I am going to demonstrate to this town what happens to federal investigators who poke around in business that does not concern them." "It concerns the United States government," Clarence said, still in that even voice, "which makes it very much their concern." Voss pressed the gun harder. Clarence's jaw tightened, but he did not make a sound. Alberta's mind was working very fast. She had 2 shots. Voss's 4 men were positioned at angles she had been mapping since she crouched behind the barrel. The nearest one was 11 feet to her left, watching the end of the street. The farthest was at the corner of the saloon, half in shadow. She did not have a clear shot at Voss from here, not without risking Clarence. The angle was wrong. She needed Voss to move. She stood up from behind the barrel, both hands visible, the derringer held loosely in her right. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I have the documents." Everyone looked at her, including Voss, and in the half-second that his attention shifted, Clarence moved. It was not a dramatic movement, it was simply precise. He dropped his weight, twisted his shoulder to break Voss's grip on his collar, and drove his elbow back into Voss's ribs with enough force to stagger him. The gun went off, the sound cracking across the street, and the shot went into the boardwalk at nobody's feet. Alberta shot the nearest deputy, the one 11 feet to her left, in the shooting arm. She heard him shout and heard his gun hit the ground. Then the air was full of the sound of horses, and Marshal Reeves came around the corner at the end of the street at a gallop with his deputies flanking him and his badge gleaming in the midday sun. And it was over in a way that was so fast it felt almost anticlimactic after everything that had led to it. Voss was on the ground, disarmed, with Clarence's knee on his back, and one of the marshal's deputies snapping handcuffs around his wrists. The 4 deputies were secured in less than 2 minutes. The deputy Alberta had shot was treated by the town's doctor, an older man named Greer, who had been watching from his office window with the expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. Clarence came to her across the street, and he was breathing hard, and he looked at her with an expression that contained approximately everything she needed to see. "You stood up," he said. "You needed him to look away from you. You could have been killed." "So could you," she said. He looked at her for a very long moment, right there on the main street of Dusty Creek, with the dust still settling, and Mrs. Marsh watching from the boarding house doorway, and Abe Tolliver leaning out of the general store with his mouth open. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the question was so careful and so raw that she had to breathe before she answered. "Yes," she said. "Go find my brother." He went. Marshal Reeves had, in fact, split his force, sending his 2nd deputy northeast to the Meridian property with the rider that Clarence had dispatched, and they had reached Daniel Fletcher 90 minutes ahead of Voss's warning rider. Daniel had been held in a locked storeroom in reasonable physical condition, having been kept alive because Meridian needed him to tell them where the survey records were. He had not told them. He had been in that room for 6 months, and he had not said a single word about where he had hidden what he had taken, and when the deputy unlocked the door and told him his sister had come to Dusty Creek, Daniel Fletcher put his face in his hands and wept. Alberta was at the edge of town waiting when the riders brought him back. She had never in her life been the kind of woman who cried in public. She cried then. She stood in the street and cried and held her brother, who was thin and bearded and shaking slightly. And they did not need to say very much to each other, because everything that needed to be said was already between them. Over Daniel's shoulder she saw Clarence watching from a few feet away, and he was looking at her with something so open and unguarded that she had to close her eyes for a moment. The following days were complicated in the specific way that legal proceedings in the territory were complicated, which is to say they required a great deal of paperwork, testimony, communication by telegraph to Santa Fe, and then to Washington, and the patient work of unraveling 8 months of Meridian's fraud. Marshal Reeves stayed in Dusty Creek to manage it, solid and methodical, and exactly the kind of official presence that the town had needed and not had. Daniel gave testimony about everything he had witnessed and recorded. The hidden survey documents were entered into federal record. The Meridian official in Santa Fe who had been holding the falsified records was arrested. 3 other Meridian representatives in the territory were taken into custody over the following weeks. The ranchers whose land had been fraudulently surveyed and purchased at fraudulent prices were another matter, a harder and slower one, because land once transferred was not easily transferred back, and the legal mechanisms for remedy were imperfect. Marshal Reeves was honest about this. Alberta listened to him explain it to a group of gathered ranchers at the church, and she watched the faces of men who had been cheated and were now being told that justice would be partial and slow and imperfect, and she felt the weight of that with a clarity that stayed with her. Clarence was part of those conversations too, and she watched him talk to the ranchers with the same directness he used for everything, not promising what could not be promised, not softening what was hard, but also not leaving them without some concrete path forward. He knew land law at a level that was extraordinary, and he used it in a way that was patient and methodical and completely without condescension. She admired him with an intensity that was beginning to be difficult to manage in close quarters. 2 weeks after Harlan Voss was taken north to Santa Fe in federal custody, she and Clarence walked out to the edge of town at sunset, by unspoken mutual agreement, and stood looking at the desert light doing extraordinary things to the red rock formations to the west. "You said," she said, "that when this was over you wanted to talk about what comes next." "I did. This is over." He was quiet for a moment. The light was extraordinary. The kind of light that made you understand why people came west and stayed, even when the staying was hard. "I have a position in Washington," he said. "There is also considerable work still to be done in this territory. The land fraud is broader than Meridian. There are cases in Arizona Territory and in Colorado and in the southern part of Utah. The office has asked me to remain in the West for the foreseeable future." He paused. "I am telling you this because I want you to understand what I am and what my life looks like before I say what I want to say. That seems fair." He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and the light was in his gray-green eyes and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. "I love you," he said. It was simple and direct and completely without performance. "I have been in love with you since approximately the second week we worked together, and I have been trying to be sufficiently patient and professional about it, and I have mostly failed, and I would like to stop failing, if you are willing." Alberta looked at him for a long moment. "Clarence," she said, "yes, I love you too. I have loved you since you sat down in that chair and rubbed your face with your hands and looked tired for approximately 20 seconds before putting all of it away again. That is when I knew." Something moved across his face that she would spend the rest of her life being glad she had seen. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood in the desert light at the edge of Dusty Creek in the summer of 1883, and it felt like the beginning of something enormous and solid and entirely theirs. He kissed her for the first time there in the last of the sunlight, careful and certain, and she kissed him back with every ounce of herself. Daniel, for his part, accepted the situation with the equanimity of a man who had spent 6 months in a locked storeroom and had decided that life was too short for anything other than the obvious. "I knew the moment I got here and saw the way she talked about you," he told Clarence when they spoke. "She does not talk about people the way she talked about you." "How does she talk about me?" "Like she's cataloging something important." Clarence smiled. "That sounds like her." "Do right by her," Daniel said, without particular heat, in the tone of an older brother who means it exactly as stated and trusts that the message is received. "That is the whole plan," Clarence said. September arrived, and with it, a cooler wind down from the mountains, and Dusty Creek began to settle into something resembling normality, or at least the version of normality that could exist in a place that had been governed by fraud and fear for almost a year, and was now learning what it meant to be without those things. A new sheriff was elected, a local man named Pryor who had ranched outside of town for 15 years, and who had the particular quality of a man who understood that his job was to serve his community rather than the reverse. Reverend Hubbard visibly relaxed. Abe Tolliver began extending credit again to the ranchers who had been afraid to come into town while Voss was in power. Mrs. Marsh, who had known more about the underlying situation than she had ever let on, sat Alberta down at the kitchen table one morning and said, "Now then, I understand there is a development with the government man." "His name is Clarence Rourke," Alberta said. "I know his name." "We are together," Alberta said. "We have not yet discussed the specifics of what that looks like going forward, but we are together." "Good," Mrs. Marsh said. "He is a serious man. You need a serious man. I have watched you for 2 months, and you are not a woman who will be happy with anything less." She poured them both tea. He is also not unhandsome, which never hurts." Alberta laughed for the first time in longer than she could calculate, and it felt like something releasing in her chest. Clarence had been traveling, in October and into November, between Dusty Creek and two other locations in the territory where the land fraud investigation had tendrils. He wrote to her when he was gone, and his letters were remarkable documents, detailed and thoughtful, containing more of himself than she suspected he was entirely comfortable with, which made them more precious. She wrote back with equal thoroughness, and his answering letters made it clear that he read everything she wrote with the same complete attention he brought to everything. He was back in Dusty Creek for Thanksgiving, which Mrs. Marsh presided over with great organizational authority, and which included a table that held Alberta and Daniel, Clarence Marshall Reeves, who had extended his stay to complete the territorial filings, Reverend Hubbard and Abe Tolliver, who brought 3 pies and apologized that he had not had time for a 4th. It was a good evening, warm with firelight and conversation, and the particular ease of people who have been through something together. Clarence sat beside Alberta, and at some point in the middle of the evening his hand found hers under the table, and she turned her palm to meet it, and that was that. Daniel was doing well. He had found work with a legitimate land survey company out of Albuquerque, arranged with the help of Marshall Reeves, who had contacts everywhere, and he was planning to go south at the end of November. He was thinner than he had been and quieter, carrying something of what 6 months in a locked room does to a person, but he was Daniel, funny and sharp and fierce in his quiet way, and he was going to be all right. On the last evening before Daniel left for Albuquerque, the 3 of them ate supper together at the boarding house, and after Mrs. Marsh had cleared the dishes, Daniel looked at Clarence for a long moment and then looked at Alberta. "You are going to ask her," he said to Clarence. It was not a question. Clarence looked at Alberta. She raised her eyebrows at him. "I was going to do that privately," Clarence said. "Ask me what?" Alberta said, though she was fairly certain she knew. Daniel stood up, pushed his chair back, and said, "I am going to the saloon for 1 drink. I will be back in 45 minutes. He looked at Clarence. "Do not waste the 45 minutes. He left. Clarence looked at Alberta. She looked at him. The firelight was doing its work on the room, and it was warm and quiet, and she could hear her own heartbeat. "I was planning to do this more deliberately," he said. "I had an arrangement in mind." "Clarence." "Yes. Ask me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I cannot offer you an easy life. I can offer you work that matters and a man who will spend the rest of his days trying to be worthy of you and a genuine willingness to build whatever we build together with you as an equal partner in every decision. I love you, Alberta. I have never said that to anyone before. I mean it with everything I have. Will you marry me?" She looked at him across the table in the firelight with 2 months of letters and 2 months of standing beside each other in the high-stakes business of right and wrong. And she thought about her father teaching them to read land, and she thought about her mother's pearl-handled derringer, and she thought about the moment on the main street when she had stood up from behind the water barrel, and she thought that this was the truest choice she had ever made. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Absolutely yes." He came around the table and took both her hands and then pulled her up from the chair and held her, and she held him back, and it was not like the movies would tell you it was, all grand and cinematic. It was warm and solid and entirely real, and his arms around her felt like the answer to a question she had been carrying for a very long time. Daniel came back in 42 minutes, not 45, and found them both still at the table but sitting beside each other now instead of across, and he looked at their faces and sat back down. "Well," he said. "She said yes," Clarence said. Daniel exhaled. "Good. Then I can leave for Albuquerque with a clear conscience." He looked at his sister. "Are you all right?" "I am better than all right," Alberta said. "I am the best I have been in 2 years. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Pa would have liked him," he said. "Just so you know." She had to press her lips together for a moment. "I know." They were married in December in Reverend Hubbard's church with its freshly painted white walls because the town had organized a painting party in November and everyone had come. The church was full on the wedding day. Mrs. Marsh wept without embarrassment. Abe Tolliver brought rice. Marshal Reeves, who had come back for the occasion from wherever the territorial investigation had taken him that month, stood straight and formal in his best coat and shook Clarence's hand afterward with an expression of sincere satisfaction. Daniel came back from Albuquerque for the week. He walked Alberta down the aisle of that small white church in the high desert of New Mexico Territory on a cold December morning in 1883. And she wore a dress that Mrs. Marsh had helped her make from fabric ordered from Santa Fe, deep blue wool, simple and well cut. And she carried 3 sprigs of desert holly tied with white ribbon, because that was what was available and it suited her perfectly. Clarence was waiting at the front of the church. He was wearing his good coat, brushed to a proper condition, and his dark hair was combed, and he looked at her coming down the aisle with an expression that she kept in her heart for the rest of her life. It was an expression of complete and unguarded wonder, as though he could not quite reconcile the fact of her with the ordinary world in which they both happened to be standing. Reverend Hubbard performed the ceremony with the particular warmth of a man who had watched this town through its worst period, and was grateful beyond expression to be standing at the beginning of something good. They exchanged rings. Clarence's ring was a simple gold band purchased from the jeweler in Santa Fe on one of his recent trips, and he slid it onto her finger with a steadiness that she noticed, because he noticed everything and she had learned to notice him noticing. Her ring for him was also simple gold, and she put it on his finger with both hands because her one hand was not entirely steady, and when she looked up, he was looking at her with that expression again, and she did not care at all that her hands were not steady. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Hubbard said, and his voice was thick with something that was not quite sorrow, but was close to it in shape, the feeling of a moment that will not come again and deserves to be felt completely while it is here. The church was warm, and the people in it were full of goodwill, and Clarence kissed her in front of all of them with the same combination of care and certainty that characterized everything about him. They spent Christmas in Dusty Creek, in the 2-room house they had rented at the edge of town, small and clean, with a wood stove that needed constant attention and a front window that looked out at the mountains turning purple in the evening light. Mrs. Marsh supplied them with enough food for approximately 6 people, which was her way of expressing love. Abe Tolliver sent a jar of good preserves and a note that said simply, "Wishing you joy." They were happy in the way that is not always loud. They ate breakfast together and worked together and talked in the evenings by the stove, and Clarence told her things about his years of work that he had never told anyone, and she told him things about the long years in Kansas City after her father died that she had never said aloud, and the telling was good for both of them. The keeping of secrets is a particular kind of weight, and they had both been carrying weight for a long time. The new year came, 1884, and with it the next phase of the land fraud case, which was moving into formal federal prosecution in Santa Fe. Clarence was required to be there for much of February and March, and Alberta went with him, because she had no intention of being left behind, and because he had meant it about equal partnership and she held him to his words. Santa Fe was a different world from Dusty Creek. Old and layered, Spanish colonial and Pueblo and American territorial, all compressed together into something that was entirely its own thing. The federal court was imposing in the way of institutions that know they represent something larger than themselves. The prosecution of Meridian Land and Minerals key executives was thorough and merciless, built on documents and testimony that left no room for alternative interpretation. Alberta sat in the gallery of the federal courtroom and watched her brother testify, and she watched Clarence testify, and she watched the faces of the men who had built their wealth on the theft of other people's land, and she felt something that was not quite satisfaction, but was the thing that satisfaction is built on. The truth, properly documented and properly spoken, doing the work it was made to do. The convictions came in April, 4 Meridian executives received federal prison sentences. The connected official in Santa Fe was removed from his position and charged separately. The land remedy process, the return of fraudulently obtained properties to their original owners, was slow and complicated and imperfect as Marshal Reeves had said it would be. But it moved forward, and several ranchers who had been cheated got their land back over the following 2 years. By spring of 1884, Alberta and Clarence were back in Dusty Creek, and the case was largely behind them, and the question of what came next was not a question so much as an ongoing conversation. Clarence had been offered a permanent position based out of Santa Fe, overseeing land fraud investigation across 3 territories. It was important work. He wanted to take it. He told her this directly, laid it out with all its implications, the travel, the uncertainty, the way the West was still actively becoming itself and the fraud was ongoing and the work mattered. "I know it is a complicated life," he said. "It is my life too," she said, "and I am good at complicated." "That is one of the things I love most about you," he said. She had an idea of her own. She had been thinking about it for weeks. She told him that she wanted to formalize her role, that she had the skills to do survey work legitimately, that her father had taught her everything he knew, that the territories needed surveyors who understood what they were looking at and why it mattered. She wanted to work alongside him in a documented capacity. He listened to all of it with his complete attention. Then he said, "I know exactly who to contact at the Federal Land Office." It took several months and more paperwork than either of them enjoyed. But by the fall of 1884, Alberta Rourke, formerly Fletcher, held a formal appointment as a surveying consultant to the Office of the United States Surveyor General. It was not a common thing. It caused some raised eyebrows in Santa Fe and more than a few among the old guard of the Federal Land Office. It also caused, in the assessments of the people who actually worked with her in the field, a rapid reassessment of whatever objections they had arrived with. She was extraordinary at it. Clarence had known she would be. He had told the land office director as much, and the land office director had said, politely and skeptically, that they would see. And then he had seen, and he had written a very good report. The work took them across the territory and into Arizona, and sometimes up into Colorado. And it was hard work, physical and demanding and often legally complicated. And they did it together in the specific way of 2 people who understand each other's capabilities completely and trust them without reservation. In the evenings in whatever town or camp they happened to be, they sat together in the way they had learned to sit together, comfortable and present, talking about the work and about the broader world and about the particular quality of whatever light was doing something interesting at that moment. Clarence had developed, or perhaps revealed because she thought it had always been there, a capacity for quiet joy that moved her every time she saw it. The way he would stop and look at a landscape with frank appreciation. The way he laughed when something was genuinely funny, not often but completely. The way he looked at her. In the winter of 1884, they received a letter from Daniel, now settled in Albuquerque, that said, among other things, that he had met a woman named Rosa Domings who worked as a teacher at a mission school, and that he was thinking about asking her to marry him, and could Alberta please write back with something encouraging. Alberta wrote back something considerably more than encouraging. She wrote 4 pages with suggestions and clarifications and strong recommendations, and a postscript from Clarence that said simply, "Ask her, Daniel. Stop thinking about it." Daniel asked. Rosa said yes. They were married in Albuquerque in March of 1885, and Alberta and Clarence came south for the wedding, and Rosa Domings Rourke, as she became, was a small, bright-eyed woman with strong opinions and a warmth that filled every room she entered, and Alberta liked her immediately and completely. There was a child coming for Alberta and Clarence in the spring of 1885. She had known since January and had told Clarence on a cold evening by the wood stove in their Santa Fe house, which they had moved into in the fall when the consulting work anchored them there enough to make a permanent base sensible. He had gone very still when she told him. Then he had looked at her with that expression, the one that contained everything, and he had reached for her hands. "Are you well?" he asked. It was the first thing he said. "Very well," she said. "Entirely well." He pressed his lips to her hands. She felt him take a long breath. When he looked up, his eyes were bright. "I did not know," he said, "that I wanted this. I had not allowed myself to want it. I want this more than I know how to say." "You say it well enough," she told him. Their son was born in June of 1885 in Santa Fe, with a doctor in attendance and Mrs. Marsh, who had come up from Dusty Creek for exactly this purpose, and who presided over the proceedings with the organized authority she brought to everything. They named him Thomas for Alberta's father. Thomas Rourke was a vigorous, opinionated infant who expressed his views on the world loudly and without diplomatic consideration. And Clarence, who had spent 8 years as a man of cool precision and measured response, was completely undone by him in the most wonderful way. Alberta watched her husband hold their son in the early morning light and felt something so large and warm that she had no name for it. Love had many rooms, she thought, and she had not known that before, and she was grateful beyond words to know it now. Thomas grew into a vigorous, opinionated toddler who had his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's dark hair and his grandfather Thomas Fletcher's stubborn certainty that he could understand anything if he looked at it carefully enough. Mrs. Marsh came to Santa Fe every few months on the stage and spent several weeks at a time being enormously useful and refusing to be told she was not needed. Reverend Hubbard wrote letters. Abe Tolliver sent packages with things from the store that he thought they might need, which they often did. Daniel and Rosa came up from Albuquerque twice a year, and those visits were full and loud and good. Rosa and Alberta talking for hours, while the men did whatever men did when they were left to their own devices, which in the case of Daniel and Clarence apparently involved a great deal of serious discussion about land law and survey methodology, because they were, Alberta thought with fond exasperation, fundamentally similar in their devotion to the work. In 1887, Clarence finished a major case that had occupied him for 2 years, a land scheme in Arizona Territory that had been running since before Meridian. The case resulted in 7 convictions and the recovery of over 100,000 acres of wrongfully obtained land. It was the largest successful land fraud prosecution in the history of the territory. The night the verdict came in, he sat at the kitchen table in Santa Fe with a glass of good whiskey that Abe Tolliver had sent for exactly this occasion, because Abe Tolliver was a man who believed in anticipating the appropriate moment. And Clarence looked at the table for a long time and then looked at Alberta. "I think," he said, "that I would like to stay in one place for a while." She looked at him. Thomas was asleep in the next room. The night outside was warm and the city was doing its evening business beyond their window. "What does that mean?" she asked. "I can continue the consulting work from here and supervise the younger investigators who are doing field work now. I do not need to be in the field the way I was." He paused. "I want to be home, Alberta. I want to be here." "You are not giving up the work," she said. It was not a question. "No, but I can do more of it from a desk than I have been willing to admit because the desk felt like retreat. I do not think it is retreat anymore. I think it is simply a different phase of the same thing." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Then stay home," she said. He turned his hand to hold hers. "Also," he said, with something in his voice that she had come to recognize as him being careful with something tender, "if Thomas is to have a brother or sister, I would rather be home for it." She looked at him for a moment. "Is that a request?" "It is an expressed preference." "I will take it under consideration," she said, and the smile was in her voice, and he heard it, and his face opened in the way she loved best. The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1889, and they named her Alina, for no particular family reason except that it was a name they both liked, strong and simple, with room for the person inside it to grow. She had Clarence's coloring and Alberta's manner, which was to say she was watchful and deliberate and occasionally startling in the accuracy of her observations. Thomas, who was 4 when Alina arrived, inspected his sister with the serious care of someone accepting a significant responsibility, and declared that she was small but appeared to be of sound construction, and that he would look after her. This he proceeded to do, consistently and with considerable dedication, for the rest of his life. Marshal Reeves visited Santa Fe in 1888, on business that took him through, and sat with them at the supper table and talked about the ongoing state of the territories and the slow, imperfect, necessary work of making law mean something in places where law had often been entirely theoretical. He was good and thorough, and committed in the way that made Alberta understand why Clarence spoke of him with unqualified respect. They talked about the ranchers of Dusty Creek and the surrounding area, how many had gotten their land back through the remedy process, how many had not, how the town itself had grown in the 5 years since Harlan Voss had been removed from it. It was better, not perfect, better, which they had all learned was the honest measure. Before he left, Marshal Reeves looked at Clarence across the table and said, "You did good work in Meridian, work that mattered. There are people ranching land right now that would have been strip-mined and abandoned if you and your wife had not done what you did." Clarence accepted this quietly, with a nod. Then he said, "My wife did the essential work. I want that on the record." Marshal Reeves looked at Alberta. "I believe that," he said. "I have always believed that." Alberta thought about the water barrel on the main street of Dusty Creek and the pearl-handled derringer and the choice to stand up, and she thought that it was a strange and good thing that the largest moments of your life looked like nothing from the outside, just a woman standing up from behind a barrel on a dusty street, and that the consequences of that one moment radiated outward in ways you could not track and would never fully know. In 1890, they made a trip back to Dusty Creek. The first time since the wedding in 1883. Thomas was 5 and Alina was 1, and the trip took 2 days by stage and was neither of the children's finest hours, but they arrived and stepped off the stage onto the same boardwalk where Alberta had stepped off 7 years before with $42 sewn into her hem and a letter in her boot. The town had changed. The church's white paint was fresh. There was a new school building. The sheriff's office had a different sign. The general store had expanded. Mrs. Marsh's boarding house was exactly as it had always been, because Mrs. Marsh was a woman who understood that some things should not be tampered with, and she was standing on the front step when the stage arrived as though she had known to the minute when they would come. She held Thomas at arm's length, examined him, declared him a fine boy who would grow up to be a serious man, and handed him a biscuit. She held Alina against her shoulder and swayed, and Alina, who was opinionated about most people, accepted this entirely. "You look well," Mrs. Marsh told Alberta. "I am well," Alberta said, "and him." She tilted her head at Clarence, who was managing the luggage from the stage with quiet efficiency. "He is very well, Mrs. Marsh looked at Clarence with the frank assessment she applied to everything. "He was already a good man when he came here," she said. "He is a better one now. That is a compliment to you both." Clarence, who had apparently heard this, looked up from the luggage with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Marsh," he said. "You are welcome," she said. "Now come in out of this heat before these children melt." They stayed in Dusty Creek for a week. They visited the church, where Reverend Hubbard was still presiding, slower now and more careful on the steps, but his voice in the Sunday service was as warm and clear as it had ever been. They visited Abe Tolliver at the general store, which was now being helped along by his son, a young man of 20 who had his father's cheerful forthrightness. They rode out, Clarence and Alberta, on the 3rd day, while Mrs. Marsh watched the children with the organizational thoroughness she brought to everything. They rode out to the dry creek bed where they had retrieved Daniel's survey documents 7 years ago, in the early morning before the day got hot. The creek bed was as dry as ever. The rock formation was still there, unchanged, indifferent in the way of rock to everything that happened at its feet. They sat on their horses for a moment and looked at it. "This is where it started," Alberta said. "I think it started earlier," Clarence said. "I think it started the morning you walked around the corner of the blacksmith shop and I nearly knocked you over." "You did not nearly knock me over. I walked into you. I was not watching where I was going." "You are always watching where you are going." "Not that morning," he said. "I was not watching that morning because I had been awake most of the night going over the case, and I was thinking about it when I should have been thinking about where I was putting my feet." He looked at her. "And then there you were, and I stopped thinking about the case entirely, which had never happened before." She looked at him in the early light, his gray-green eyes and the 7 years that had settled into his face in ways she loved, the small lines at the corners of his eyes, the gray beginning at his temples. "I knew your name was not Clark," she said. "I know you knew. I could tell by the way you said it." "You could tell everything by looking at me," he said. "You always could. It terrified me, and I found it to be the greatest relief of my life simultaneously." She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand, and he held it with the grip of a man who had learned that holding on to the things that matter is not weakness, but its own kind of courage. They rode back to Dusty Creek in the morning light, and the town was waking up around them as they came in. Smoke from chimneys, the sound of the blacksmith already at work, the stage company's horses being led out for the day, and it was ordinary and beautiful in the specific way of a place that has come through something and chosen to keep going. Thomas was in the boarding house yard when they returned, having charmed Mrs. Marsh into letting him help her with the morning's garden work, which he was doing with the same serious dedication he brought to everything. Eleanor was on the front step, sitting in the good morning light with the alert attention of a child who has decided that the world is extremely interesting and intends to take thorough notes. Clarence dismounted and went to Thomas first, ruffling his hair, and Thomas, who was 5 and therefore ambivalent about hair ruffling but inclined toward tolerance when his father did it, accepted this and showed him the lettuces. Then Clarence went and picked up Eleanor, who regarded him with her watchful dark eyes for a moment and then leaned her head against his shoulder with complete confidence. Alberta stood in the yard of Mrs. Marsh's boarding house in Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the summer of 1890, and she looked at her husband holding their daughter in the morning light with their son, explaining the difference between lettuces to him at his knee. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stage onto this boardwalk 7 years ago with $42 and a letter in her boot, and so much fear she could taste it. She was glad beyond all expression to be that woman, and also to have become this one. The years that followed were full ones. Clarence's work from Santa Fe shaped land policy in ways that rippled outward further than either of them could fully track. The younger investigators he mentored brought cases that built on the foundation he had laid. The legal precedents established in the Meridian prosecution were cited in cases across the territories and eventually, as those territories became states, in the courts of those states. Daniel and Rosa had 3 children, 2 boys and then a girl, and the Fletcher and Rourke households were frequently combined in the way of families who have chosen each other as well as arrived that way. Thomas and his oldest Fletcher cousin were inseparable during visits, different in temperament but complementary, the way the best friendships are. Eleanor took notes on everyone. Alberta's surveying consultancy expanded over the years as the Federal Land Office in Santa Fe came to understand what they had in her. She trained 2 younger women who came west with similar skills and fewer opportunities, and she did this with the same patient thoroughness that Clarence applied to mentoring his investigators. She wrote 2 technical papers on survey methodology that were published in a Federal Land Office bulletin and read, to her wry amusement, by people who would never know they were written by a woman who had spent a year in Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory, dismantling a land fraud conspiracy with a two-shot derringer and a refusal to be frightened into silence. She was 37 in 1896, and Clarence was 44, and they had been married for 13 years, and she thought sometimes about what it meant to build something with someone over time, the accumulation of shared mornings and difficult days, and the specific knowledge of each other that only years of paying attention can produce. She knew that he needed quiet after large social obligations, not distance from her but from the world, and that the best thing she could do after a formal dinner in Santa Fe was to walk home with him in the night air and not require conversation. She knew that he was most worried about things when he was least likely to say so, and that the right response to this was not to press but to stay present. She knew that he found Thomas's growing intellectual confidence quietly extraordinary, and that he was sometimes moved to a depth that embarrassed him by the most ordinary moments of fatherhood, Alina running to him, Thomas showing him something he had worked out. He knew that she needed, occasionally, to be in the open land, not the city, not the office, but somewhere with a horizon. He arranged for these occasions without being asked. He knew that she still carried some weight from the years after her father died and before she came west, the particular mark of a person who has had to be sufficient to themselves for too long, and that the best response to this was simply to be reliably, demonstrably there, which he was always without fail. Thomas Rourke went to the university in Albuquerque in 1903, studying law because of course he was, and Alberta and Clarence stood on the platform watching his train pull away, and she put her hand in Clarence's arm and felt him take a long, steady breath. "He is ready," she said. "I know. He is entirely ready." "I know," Clarence said again, and she heard in his voice the thing that had no easy name, the pride and the ache that were the same feeling in different clothes, and she held his arm tighter. Alina, who was 14 in 1903 and had been taking thorough notes on the world for 14 years, watched her brother's train disappear and said, "He is going to come back insufferable." "Alina," Clarence said. "He is going to come back wonderful, and I am going to be very glad for it," Alina amended, without particular change of tone. Alberta pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. They walked back from the station in the autumn light of 1903, Clarence and Alberta and Alina, through the streets of Santa Fe that had become as familiar to Alberta as any place she had ever known, and she thought that she had come west looking for her brother and she had found him, and she had found something else entirely that she had not known to look for. This life, this man, these children, this work that mattered, this community of people who knew her and were known by her. The West was still becoming itself. That had not stopped and would not stop for a long time. There were still injustices in the land, still people being cheated and underpaid and underrepresented and ignored by the systems that were supposed to serve them. The work that Clarence had dedicated his career to was not finished. It would not be finished in their lifetimes, but it was better. The territories becoming states had brought new legal structures, imperfect but present. The precedents from the land, fraud prosecutions of the 1880s, were woven into the fabric of how land law was practiced. There were younger men and women doing the work now who had not been born when Alberta stepped off that stage in Dusty Creek in 1883, and they were doing it with tools and legal frameworks that had been built, in part, by the work that she and Clarence and Daniel and Marshall Reeves had done in that year of secrets and danger in the high desert. She thought about this sometimes in the evenings when the children were elsewhere, and it was just the two of them in the quiet of the Santa Fe house, Clarence at his desk with his papers or beside her reading, and the firelight doing its good work on the room. She was proud of what they had done. She was proud of what they had built. And she was, in the particular and irreducible way that had nothing to do with any of that, simply happy to be in this room with this man, who looked up from whatever he was reading to find her watching him and looked back with those gray-green eyes and the expression that had not changed in 20 years, still that careful, open thing that was all of him at once. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Everything." He closed his book and reached across and took her hand with the same certainty he had taken it 100 times and 1,000 times. And outside the window, Santa Fe was doing its evening business. And the stars were coming out over the high desert with the particular clarity that only came at this altitude and this distance from everything. And Alberta Rourke, born Fletcher, daughter of a surveyor and sister of a man who had once hidden documents in a rock formation in the New Mexico desert, sat in the lamplight of her own house and held the hand of the man she had chosen and been chosen by, and thought that this, all of this, was the thing she had walked around a corner one morning in 1883, and found without knowing she was looking for it, and she was grateful for it every day, every single day. Thomas graduated from law in 1907 and came home to Santa Fe exactly as wonderful as Alberta had predicted he would be, and not even slightly insufferable, because he had his father's core of genuine humility underneath the considerable intellectual confidence. He clerked for a federal judge in Albuquerque and then established his own practice, specializing, of course, in land law. Alina studied at the university in Santa Fe that had opened by then to women students, studied mathematics and survey methods, and eventually, with the combined endorsement of her mother and the federal land office director who had long since stopped raising his eyebrows at anything Alberta brought to his attention, became the second woman to hold a formal surveying appointment in the territory. Daniel and Rosa's children grew up and scattered west and south, and the family connections remained strong through letters and visits, and the occasional long journey by the new rail lines that were threading the West together in ways that still sometimes startled Alberta with their speed. Mrs. Marsh died in 1905 at the age of 82 in her own boarding house in Dusty Creek, having supervised the breakfast service that morning, and told the guests exactly what she thought of the quality of the biscuits, which she considered substandard, and gone to lie down and simply not gotten up again. It was, Reverend Hubbard wrote to Alberta, an entirely appropriate ending for a woman who had done things her way from beginning to end. Alberta cried when the letter came. Then she sat with Clarence and told him everything she remembered about Mrs. Marsh from that first evening, the street room versus the alley room, the salt pork, the thorough knowledge of every resident of Dusty Creek, the hand that had carried a folded note to Clarence on the morning when everything came apart and was remade on the main street. She saved things, Alberta said, in her own way, by knowing everyone and caring about them and staying. Not everyone can ride out to the dry creek bed, Clarence said. Some people save things by staying in place and being reliable. I think that might be harder, Alberta said. I think it might be too, he said. Reverend Hubbard retired in 1908 and was replaced by a young minister from the East who Abe Tolliver's son wrote to say was very good and earnest, and would do very well once he learned to tolerate the heat without complaining about it. Abe Tolliver himself lived to be very old and ran his general store in Dusty Creek until his son took it over entirely, and on his 81st birthday he received a letter from Alberta and Clarence that he apparently read several times, and then folded into his breast pocket, and was found to still be carrying when he died 2 years later. The letter said, among other things, that they thought of Dusty Creek often and with great affection, and that they were grateful for the years they had spent there, and that they hoped he knew he was part of what had been good about that place and that time. He had written back, before he died, one page in a hand that was not as steady as it had once been, saying that he was glad they had come and gladder they had stayed long enough to do what needed doing, and that he hoped they were well, and that he had not forgotten a single day of it. Neither had they. In the spring of 1910, Alberta and Clarence Rourke celebrated 27 years of marriage with a supper at their home in Santa Fe that included Thomas and his wife, a practical and brilliant woman named Harriet who had grown up in Colorado, and Alina, who at that point was deep in the most significant survey work of her career and would talk about little else, and Daniel and Rosa, who had come up from Albuquerque for the week. The table was full and the conversation was loud and the food was good, and afterward, when the others had gone into the front room, Alberta stood at the kitchen window washing dishes, and Clarence came and dried them beside her in the easy silence of two people who have been doing things beside each other for so long that the proximity is its own language. 27 years, she said. Yes. Do you know what I think about sometimes? Tell me. I think about that room above the blacksmith shop, she said. The first evening I came to you, how bare it was, how careful you were about everything. He was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the dish he was drying. Was terrified, he said, not of you, of how much I immediately did not want you to leave. She looked at him. You were terrified of that from the first evening. From the moment you knocked on the door, he said. I opened it and there you were, and I thought this is going to change everything. And then I was terrified because I could not afford for everything to change. Not then, not in the middle of what we were doing. But it did anyway. It did anyway, he said, entirely and irreversibly. She laughed softly, and he heard it and smiled, and she thought that she would remember this moment always, this ordinary spring kitchen in 1910, the dish towel in his hands, the voices of their family from the front room, the window showing the evening settling over Santa Fe, this man beside her who was still, after 27 years, her favorite person to be in any room with. Clarence, she said. Yes. I would do it all exactly the same. He put down the dish towel and turned to her and took her face in his hands, the way he had learned to do over the years, with the particular care of someone who understands what they are holding, and he looked at her for a long moment. So would I, he said, every single day of it. He kissed her in the kitchen with the dishes still to be finished and their family in the next room, and she kissed him back with the full weight of 27 years and the lightness that love, properly tended, somehow manages to hold inside all that weight. And outside the window the desert stars were coming out over Santa Fe one by one in the deepening dark, each one exactly where it was supposed to be. The story of Alberta and Clarence Rourke was not a simple story, and it was not a quiet one, and it had not been easy. It had moved through secrets and danger, and the high-stakes business of trying to make truth mean something in a place where powerful people had decided it should not. It had moved through grief and loneliness, and the particular courage it takes to step off a stage in a strange town and decide to stay until the thing is done. But it was, from the morning she knocked on the door of a room above a blacksmith shop in Dusty Creek in 1883 to the spring kitchen in Santa Fe in 1910, and every year beyond, a love story. Entirely and completely and without any reservation whatsoever, it was a love story, and it was theirs.